We've also, oh, thank you. Thank you for recording. And we are also recording this session today. And also, please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We will reserve some time towards the end to answer your questions. A couple of points I would like to emphasize. This webinar is for general education purpose only and does not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the IPA or its staff. During the webinar, the speakers will discuss the role of net zero buildings to accelerate decarbonization, look at policies and best practices in the landscape of net zero buildings nationally, and provide some insights on how Illinois is moving toward net zero energy buildings. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Our speakers for the session are Anthony Starr, Senior Advisor, Interim Planning and Procurement Chief here at the IPA. Lois Bettsale, Senior Vice President at White & Company. White & Company is the leading integrated design and delivery firm based in Chicago. Lois's work at the company focuses on creating leading-edge sustainable facilities, formulating policies that promote and/or remove barriers to sustainability, and maximizing environmental potential for projects. She is a national leader on sustainable planning and is a public policy advisor to elected officials and has participated in the development of policies to lessen the negative impacts of the built environment on health and natural resources. Our last speaker for the session is Katie Kaluzny. She's the Associate Director at Illinois Green Alliance, a membership-driven nonprofit that works to promote green buildings and sustainable communities. In this role, Katie directs and implements education programs, fosters organizational partnerships and collaborations. Before Illinois Green, Katie worked for the Chicago Department of Environment, leading education programs at the Chicago Center for Green Technology. A huge welcome to our speakers. This is just an agenda. Again, we did just the housekeeping and introductions. Lois's slide will cover overview on net zero buildings. Katie will talk about how is Illinois doing in the net zero building landscape. And Anthony will talk about role of on-site solar. And then we'll reserve some time for the Q&A. For those that are new to our Power Hour webinars, Power Hour is a series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. This is our last Power Hour for the year on navigating the energy transition, growing pains and path forward, which is taking place on December 16th. Again, for those that are new to our Power Hour and our agency, the IPA is an independent state agency created by Illinois law in 2007. Our duties include developing and implementing procurement plans for electricity supply for utility customers. We're also responsible for developing and implementing solar incentive programs and implementing the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a public policy designed to increase the development of renewables here in Illinois. With that, I would like to give the floor to Lois to talk about net zero buildings. Lois.
Thank you, Mega. If you could go to the next slide. Oh, one back. Well, hello, everybody. As Mega said correctly, I'm Senior Vice President at White & Company. I'm also Chief Sustainability Officer and a practicing architect. And on the slide you have before you several buildings, not all, of the projects that we've been working on at White & Company as net zero energy designs, starting back in 2003 with the building up in the upper right-hand corner, the Evelyn Pease Tyner Center at Air Station Prairie. The building was a 3,000 square foot building with a 17 kW array that was designed to cover all of the generation in the building, which had geothermal, and it was it's a high insulated and high performing envelope. But the owners were going to occupy the building about 50% of the time. And when they got the facility online, they loved it so much that they kept it open twice as long. So it never functioned as a net zero energy building. But in those days, we were grappling with what exactly a net zero energy building is. And each of the projects here, some which I will go into a little detail on later on, represented our best efforts at designing a building that was net zero. So if you go to the next slide, we'll define what that is. So it's a building that generates as much power on site on an annual basis as the underlying building uses in that same annual period. Most common energy generation source is on-site photovoltaics. Wind would also serve, but it's a much dicier prospect. Next slide, please. So let me show you in this snapshot, this is an energy model output that shows on a typical curve in Illinois, how a building would use energy and how it would, solar overhead would generate power. So you can see when the bars, like the bar in January at the far left, there's a shorter green bar than there is an energy consumption bar on the top that's represented by blue and orange. So in the month of January, the building will not generate as much solar power as it consumes energy underfoot in form of, in this case, gas and electricity. And you can see that in the summer months when solar is peak, the energy consumption inside the building is lower. So on an annual basis, what's used on the top has got to equal or be greater than what's used, what's generated overhead. Next slide, please. So there's another fine distinction, and that is there are many buildings that will say that they are designed to net zero energy, or they'll say they're net zero energy. There are two categories. There are buildings that are emerging, which means they're on the process of studying their performance characteristics. After a period of 12 consecutive months, if a building proves the hypothesis that it's generating the equivalent amount of energy overhead as it's consuming in the building underfoot, then it's actually listed as a verified net zero energy building. Next slide, please. So what are the key characteristics of a project that's pursuing net zero energy? And most of these buildings that I shared with you at the top of this discussion are greenfield buildings. They're not renovations. A building could also be renovated, and it's a little more tricky because some of the key characteristics of a building that's suitable for net zero energy is that it's highly energy efficient with high performance envelope. So you'd have to consider some real investments in the envelope of a building if it's not already high performance to get it up to snuff so that you can drive down demand. Generally, buildings that have lower to window to wall ratio perform better because, as we know, the U value of windows is it's not as efficient as a wall where you can stuff it with insulation. Low rates of infiltration, which is key, and as we see in our energy models, really make a material difference in the efficiency of a building, and high efficient building systems in the form of lighting and HVAC primarily, but also those pesky plug loads and peripherals that can drive up energy use. Then once you have squeezed out all of that waste energy in the underlying building, then you look at your site. Usually it's overhead. We have had projects where we put ground mounted solar and on the same property owned by the owner, and that will serve as well. Some would consider in a tighter site putting structured solar over a carport or ground mounted in a site that had more space. So that on-site renewable resource obviously is sized to meet the underlying predicted energy use of the building. We also build in a margin because the sun and the weather is not always predictable. The uses of the buildings are not always predictable. And so it's really important to build a 10 to 15% margin in for excess power. And the sun doesn't always shine, as I'll show you in some future slides. Then finally, the last really key characteristic is that this building, once it comes into service, is really put into action, and monitoring building performance is critical to meeting that goal of being a verified net zero energy building. So it's imperative to have a dedicated person to record and monitor the energy building systems, including HVAC, lighting, plug loads, elevator, hot water, and the renewable energy generation source. It's important that the monitoring is at a systems level, because the only prayer to course correct if something is going cattywampus is to know how those individual components are working and measured against a predicted energy model, so that there's a path to understanding how the building should perform. And in general, when we're bringing these buildings into service, we use commissioning in a different way than in a traditional green building. And that is to say that we bring on commissioning agents who will not only turn the building over, but do all the checks on the metering systems and stay with the building for an 18-month period after occupancy to help the building professional who's dedicated to the systems calibrate and produce reports that show how the building is performing. Next slide, please. So here's a net zero energy building that was verified in the first 12 months since the generation was turned on, which is, I have to tell you, in the 6 or 7 buildings I've worked on, unbelievably great, because usually you spend the first few months wandering in the woods trying to get everything to work right. But in a typical month here, this is net energy consumption. So this is the amount of energy a building is using after the generation is accounted for. And you can see that from November to February, and actually a little bit into March, the prediction was that the buildings would use more energy than they generated on site. And from April through October, the buildings generated more than they used underfoot. The trick is that they generated enough of a surplus to cover the deficit in those colder and darker months. Next, please. So I'm going to share a few case studies with you very quickly. This is the building that was actually the first verified net zero energy building in the state of Illinois. It is the building that's in the foreground here is an addition known as the East Building Addition, which is about 56,000 square feet on 3 levels. As you can see in this slide, there's a green roof in the foreground. There's some greenhouse roofs on the roof, mechanical penthouse, and what you can't really see in this photo is there's actually a rooftop garden and an urban agriculture installation, and there's very little solar on the premises exactly. And you see in the distance in this photo, the large solar array, which is adjacent to this addition. That was necessary because of the curricular uses of the rooftop in this case. The building was LEED Platinum certified and also net zero energy certified by ILFI, which is the International Living Futures Institute, which generally produces living building challenge buildings. We had a couple of exceptions there. It's an all electric building. One of the things that really served to help was that the VRF compressors were actually put into a room as opposed to outside, that was mildly conditioned to help with the sort of extreme differences in temperature from outside air. So it was mildly conditioned upstream. Next slide, please. This was a passive house certified building, which actually the building has a lower window to wall ratio. It has an R60 roof, R40 walls, and R34 walls on the high ones. It's precast. The infiltration rate was extremely low. And passive house, if you're not familiar with it, requires buildings to have an actual finite budget for heating and cooling. And our experience in these net zero energy buildings are the HVAC loads are the largest loads in the building. The building also received a $1 million grant from the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation. It has not yet been verified. It's had a bunch of hiccups. And most recently, we added a 36 kW ground mounted array to continue in the effort to achieve net zero energy on this building. Next slide, please. The last case study, I actually showed you the chart earlier, and I mentioned that the project achieved net zero energy verification in its first 12 months of operation. That's a activity center that's also passive house and source zero certified. It's 44,000 square feet. And it also was a grant receiver. Actually, all three of these projects were grant recipients, which in our view really helped to encourage the owners to move forward with this because it's brand new in Illinois. And the grants paid for the premium costs of the efficiency, the greater efficiency in the underlying building, as well as for the solar infrastructure overhead and the metering. This one also has a very low window to wall ratio. As you can see, there's a series of punched windows and it's 16% window to wall ratio with a high insulated envelope and roof. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the solar overhead on that Techni Prairie project that I just showed you. It has almost a 313 kilowatt array. The panels are 370 watts each. In the early days on the Tyner Center that I talked to you about at the very beginning, the panels were 250 watts. So the efficiencies and the evolution in the available technology has really come a long way in making net zero possible. Next slide, please. So let's put this in motion for a minute. These are snapshots from our monthly reports at two different points in the verification process. I have to tell you that it feels to me like it's kind of music. I've been staring at these charts for a few years, and you can see on the left is a snapshot of a January 2021, and you can see how little solar is in the green below and how little generation there was. And the blue line that snakes through the upper part of the slide is actually the temperature, the average temperature. And you can see how when it plummets, the HVAC loads skyrocket. And then conversely, this chart on the right is April. And so you can see how in April, we have much lower HVAC uses and much higher generation. And you can see marching through both slides, the black and the blue are plug loads and lighting loads. You can see how pretty consistent they are across all of the, both of the months. And you can also see these two little soldiers here, which are weekends. So you begin to see occupancy patterns in these charts, and they really help to understand sort of the tempo and use of the building. Next slide, please. This is July and August and their generation. So we also study the generation with overlaying the cloud cover because we have become very sensitized to if it's a really cloudy month with a lot of rain, if there's a lot of sunshine. We've had, in this August chart on the right, I think we were way over predicted energy generation because it was just a very sunny month. And there have been months like I showed you on the last slide in January where it was more cloud covered than normal in January, and we had very little generation, or we had giant snowfall and the snow sat on the panels for a few days and really obscured any ability to generate power. But on that annual basis, with that margin, we're actually able to meet that energy generation. And we actually had the Techni Prairie project. The building manager was so devoted to achieving net zero, he sent a crew up to dust the panels off, and he actually really beat the January prediction for generation. Next slide, please. One of the things about passive house buildings is their envelopes are so efficient that they really also contribute not just to lower energy, but to much higher and more steadfast comfort. This chart here shows a time at Prairie, at Park, the Plainfield project, when the HVAC was turned off for 2 days over Christmas Eve and came back the day after Christmas. And even though it was as low as 10 degrees outside, the interior temperature of the building only drifted 6 degrees in 48 hours. So these buildings are really delivering comfort, not just denying people the ability to use energy. Next slide, please. So some of the barriers to bringing net zero energy buildings, and this is a perfect audience to talk to this about, is really the evolving place of net zero energy buildings in the world of the grid. In the early days, I would be lucky if I picked up the phone and found somebody at ComEd to talk to about interconnection agreements, because they were overwhelmed with all this work, and it felt like there was only one person working on net zero and interconnection agreements. Utilities have been asking us and our teams, when we bring these projects on board, to make sure that they're not oversized, that we're actually designing systems that are scaled to be utilized on site. And if in the ILFI system for Living Building Challenge, they want generation sources to be what's called net positive, where they're putting more energy on the grid than they're generating. In cases where there are buildings that are on a campus, if an owner generates more power than they use underfoot, they're allowed to get credit for those extra kilowatt hours on the campus setting. If they are a standalone building without other ancillary uses, anything they generate over and above their target, they lose credit for. On this particular building, the building was occupied in January, and we weren't able to turn on the photovoltaics until March because ComEd was really swamped, and the ability to test the system and give us the go-ahead to turn on the PVs took a lot longer. And it was really hard to get to really schedule and understand how to bring the building into service given the utility. So I think there can be a lot better communication, and should be, because there's a big opportunity for how net zero buildings can be part of the solution for decarbonizing the energy picture of our world. And I have one more slide if you would go to it. And that is sort of, what are the benefits of net zero energy? And I want to say now and into the future, because right now, that reality that could be doesn't exist yet. So what does exist is that clean energy buildings actually produce less pollution, and they have positive health impacts because they're not putting emissions from fossil fuels into the air. What they could be, but they aren't right now, is they could actually be a really great form of resilience. All of the systems that we put into place now are grid connected, and if there is an emergency situation those grids are disconnected and the solar panels are disconnected and they're not generating any power that the building can use. If the buildings are required to have batteries in order to have a place to bank energy. But if there was a power outage that went on for days, if the sun was shining, we have to figure out a way that we can use the solar panels overhead. And right now we haven't figured that out. Finally, I just came back from Greenbuild in San Francisco, which is a green building conference a couple of weeks ago. And there was a lot of conversation about looking at not just how buildings could be net zero energy, but how net zero energy buildings could be part of the solution of shaving peak energy and addressing the grid when it is at its most carbon intense time. So it could be used to shave peak loads. It could be used if the generation sources on the grid are particularly driven by fossil fuels. The building could be signaled to use batteries instead of to draw power from the grid. So these scenarios require battery storage and battery uses. And most of these buildings now are relying on the grid really as the bank. So I'm going to pass the baton now to Katie, who's going to take it into a different level. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois. I'm excited to keep talking about getting to zero in Illinois and tell you a little bit about the Illinois Green Alliance and some of the pathways to zero and policy initiatives we've been seeing along the way. So you can go to the next slide. Just a little bit about Illinois Green Alliance first. Illinois Green, as Mega mentioned at the beginning, we're a membership-driven nonprofit organization that advances green buildings and sustainable communities for all. We are also the local chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council for Illinois. We have a strategic plan that's pushing the green building industry to get on the path to net zero. And we achieve that work through educational events such as panels and building tours, engaging communities and partnering with organizations across Illinois, and by advocating for new policies and legislation, especially around net zero and decarbonization. We have a lot of webinars on our website about net zero and some great building case studies at illinoisgreenalliance.org that you can check out if you get extra excited after this webinar to dig in more. Next slide. So I can tell you just a little bit about the green building path to zero, and really what I've seen over the past 20 years here is, people have been talking about net zero for a long time, as Lois mentioned about the Tyner Center. A lot of it is about having the technology and the ability to get there, and also just understanding the building science behind that. But back 20 years ago, people were working on the first LEED projects, which is a rating system by the U.S. Green Building Council. In fact, Lois was working on one of those first LEED pilot projects. And that was looking at all of the different aspects of green building and really getting people on the pathway to thinking about energy use, site and orientation of their building, the transportation people take to the building, what does the landscaping look like, and is it native plants, the air quality, the materials that are used, all of the different pieces. There was the first LEED Platinum Municipal Project, the Center for Green Technology, that was built in 2002. And there were some policies that were passed earlier on in the early 2000s around the Illinois Green Buildings Act, which required new state buildings to meet at least LEED Silver. And also in the city of Chicago, Chicago passed a green building ordinance to require municipal buildings, public buildings to meet LEED Silver as well. And so those policy actions really started bringing people towards a greater knowledge of how to build green buildings. And Illinois was recognized with the state with the most LEED square footage per capita than any other state just about 10 years ago. And we've continued to be on that top 10 list every year since. And a lot of the reason is because of some of those policies that were passed early on that got people to really have to learn and get educated and work on projects that were pursuing these strategies. And also some policies that passed in Chicago later on, which was looking at the continued energy use of buildings over time. So like an energy benchmarking ordinance that's been passed in Evanston and Chicago. And that's really helping people understand not just what the building has been built to, but how is it performing after that initial construction. There's also been some really great programs and projects along the way that have continued to educate all different aspects of the building sector. But really, as more and more folks that were building LEED projects and green building projects, even more rating systems have come out. So I'm going to go on to the next slide really quick and really see how those certifications have evolved over time. Originally, there was just that first LEED green building rating system back in the late 90s. And now there's a lot of different organizations that all have developed green building rating systems that focus on different things, like really focused on energy and air quality, like the FIAS standard, the Living Future standard, which looks at how to be net positive in energy, water, and waste. There's others for homes. There's others for all different types of LEED buildings, from homes to new construction, commercial interiors. But now all of those rating systems and all of those organizations that have developed them have come up with different paths to zero as well. So more recently, what you're seeing people pursue, especially early adopters like Lois and White and Company, are things like ILFI Zero Energy. The ILFI, the Living Future Institute, also has a zero carbon rating. Similarly, the LEED rating system has a LEED Zero Carbon, LEED Zero Energy. FIAS, or the Passive House Institute US, has a Source Zero rating. And then the Department of Energy has a Net Zero Energy Ready Homes program as well. So looking at how do you build a home and add the solar capacity to be net zero energy ready. And all of these conversations 20 years ago seemed crazy to be talking about net zero buildings, but the technology and the firms and the owners that have really decided to be those early adopters and want to figure out how to do it have made this pathway possible, and to show that this can happen in more places. And so if you go to the next slide, you're starting to see headlines like these all over the country. Looking at the White House just released a net zero roadmap. There's cities all over the country, Denver, New York, Washington State, that are all passing, Boston, they're all passing codes or policies to help people move on the path towards zero energy and zero carbon, and releasing different tools and resources for policy guidance and for design teams and for owners to figure out the financing and methods to get there. And it's just wonderful to see. I've worked in this industry for a long time, and so has Lois. And to see headlines like this on a daily basis is really exciting, and definitely has come a long way since when I started in this work several years ago. So next slide. And some of the tools that you're starting to see are helpful for states and cities to look at adopting policy. So they don't have to start creating things from scratch, but what is out there already. Groups like the New Buildings Institute, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and other national labs have been putting out tools for stretch codes, for building electrification roadmaps. How do you look at building performance standards for existing buildings, climate-friendly buildings, resilient buildings? So there's all of these really great resources to help people take what's been learned by others and start adapting and adopting it to their personal situation in their city or their state. Next slide. In Illinois specifically, the policy landscape and trends that we're seeing here, just last year, Illinois passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And within that act, it does many things, but two things in particular. It enables the creation of a green bank, which helps to support financing for high performance projects, and also the development of a net zero stretch code that can be then adopted by municipalities throughout the state. And the Capital Development Board is in the process right now of developing that stretch code to be ready for adoption by July 2023 for municipalities. There's also a lot of conversation around building decarbonization and electrification, where that's feasible and possible. So looking at policy and utility incentives to reduce energy use, switch appliances and fleets, and HVAC from fossil fuels over time. Also, what people are looking at are energy benchmarking policies and building performance standards, and requiring buildings over a certain square footage to track and report use annually, or meet a minimum energy performance at set dates over time. And then also there's just a really big increase from corporations and the finance industry around health and wellness and ESG reporting, which I hear so much lately. So there's this increased demand for healthy buildings, air quality improvements, and reporting to investors on sustainability practices and metrics, which is really continuing to drive the private sector adoption, while also making it easier for policy adoption along the way. But again, all of these early adopters, like the projects Lois mentioned earlier, are able to help these conversations be easier moving forward and show that this is possible in Illinois and not just in California or Boston or New York, where you saw some of the earlier policies come online. Next slide. Illinois Green, a couple of years ago, actually got to start creating a net zero honor roll. So Lois mentioned earlier in her slides about how a net zero building becomes verified. That's after 12 months of performance and proving that you have 12 months of net zero energy use annually. There's 3 projects so far in Illinois that have been verified by the New Buildings Institute, which is a national database of net zero projects that are tracking both on the emerging side, people that have committed to net zero, and then on the verified side, and those that have achieved it and proved that with their data. 2 of these are projects Lois talked about earlier. The White & Company was highly involved in designing and planning the Adlai Stevenson High School addition in Lincolnshire and the Techney Prairie Activity Center in Northbrook. Also, the Carroll Community Center in Oak Park was a new addition and renovation on an existing building. And those 3 projects are the first 3 in Illinois to have that verified status of net zero energy over 12 months of a period. If you go to the next slide. We also have a number of them on the watch list. So here's a lot of projects that are in progress. Some of them are built already and in their performance period, trying to get that 12 months of continued performance with the renewable energy on site. And some of those projects are still in construction and still in the planning phases. So we have our eye on all of these. And you'll notice a lot of them are municipal projects, they're public projects, park district projects, and some affordable housing projects. And what's exciting about that is it's people choosing to lead by example in their community with the money they have to put these projects together. And hopefully that helps drive the private sector, but also, again, as I mentioned, helps with the policy adoption to show that these projects are choosing to pursue it and are able to over time. Next slide. One of the ways a lot of those projects have been able to move forward with these are from different funding and financing tools that are unique to Illinois. The Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation started as net zero energy building program several years ago. And this is eligible for nonprofit buildings and also public buildings and throughout the state of Illinois. If they're pursuing net zero energy, it's a grant program where you can receive up to $2 million towards your project. If you're able to also prove that you're pursuing and able to achieve net zero energy through either the ILFI zero energy rating system or the FIAS source zero. And the grant program works where you receive the grant proving that you're pursuing this certification and you meet all of the eligibility requirements. You get a percentage of the grant when construction starts, a percentage of the grant when construction finishes, and then you get the final amount of the grant, which is still a big hefty amount after you prove that 12 months of performance period. And this grant has been really wonderful in helping to move projects forward and bridging the gap of financing to take projects that are early adopters still from what a base building and very highly efficient building would cost to take it to that next level and the investment of the photovoltaic and maybe higher HVAC equipment or additional insulation on the envelope. Next slide. Illinois Green also put a net zero trend survey out to our members and constituents earlier this year. And it was really exciting to see 20% of the respondents of the survey said they are currently or previously worked on a building project pursuing net zero carbon or energy in Illinois. 33% said their firm has worked on a net zero project elsewhere and hope to work on it here. And then 45% of respondents said they are confident they'll be working on a net zero project in Illinois within the next 18 months. That's really exciting news. It shows that this is not just these first few projects that are trying to pursue, but there's others in the works that we may not be aware of. And we'll keep tracking those and looking to report back. But really excited to see some of this. Next slide. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some barriers and also some opportunities. Some of the barriers that we are still hearing, and we had through that net zero survey as well, and through some of the education sessions where we've done some surveying around net zero, is that there are still some community owner developer finance community issues with first cost versus operational savings, and the ability to reconcile that with funders and investors. Really still with aesthetics around building envelope and window to wall ratio preferences. People love a glass building, and that is definitely not the most efficient way to build a building to get to net zero. And so, changing some perspective and around aesthetics, and really still having enough natural light and being able to have a little bit more building envelope is really going to be essential for these projects to happen. The availability of equipment during the construction timeline and supply chain issues with panels, with heat pumps, with all of these items hasn't been helped by some of the issues around supply chain during COVID. But certainly, as there's more demand for net zero buildings, more demand for this high efficiency equipment, that supply chain availability is going to be essential for those projects to be successful. And then workforce experience and training for high performance design and construction. Some of these technologies are newer, and also really making sure the building envelope is as tight as possible with all of the right equipment and materials is essential to make sure that the building performs the way it is designed to over time. And so additional training and finding the qualified workforce to put this equipment in and to help design on these projects is essential. And then this voluntary adoption versus regulation and policy. The folks that are designing net zero projects right now, no one's requiring them to do so. It is folks that have decided that this is important for them to show to their community, to show that they could do it, or to have that net zero energy over time. But others have said if there was regulation or policy, they certainly would do it, but they aren't going to do it until it happens. And so that's one side. You always have the early adopters and voluntary piece, but in order to see more of this happen, some regulations and policies are going to need to move forward to help make that workforce experience, the training, move forward. And then the last slide. Some opportunities to advance net zero in Illinois. These flagship projects are adding the knowledge base around net zero building. We're maximizing energy efficiency and envelope requirements through code and policy adoption. Every time the code gets a little bit more stringent, that helps on the other side to make sure that construction is going to be able to meet net zero energy if you added on solar as well. The requirements for new buildings to offset energy consumption with on-site generation when feasible. The stretch code that I mentioned that the Capital Development Board is creating right now. And then that would need to be adopted by municipalities throughout the state to really move things forward. Utility incentives to increase offset incremental costs, that trained workforce, and then these state, municipal, and institutional buildings leading by example is just a really great way to show that this is possible in Illinois and move things forward. And I think that might be my last one, but I'm not sure. All right, great. Thank you. I'm excited to take the questions at the end. I'll move on to Anthony.
Great. Thank you, Katie and Lois. I think that was a really great overview of the net zero building movement and some of the issues and opportunities it's creating. So I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit and talk about how this fits into some of the sort of policies and programs that the Illinois Power Agency works in the state's renewable portfolio standard. So we go to the next slide, please. So thinking about this at a high level, what from the consumer point of view, what are the renewable energy options that are available in Illinois? And I'm laying out here 3. There's actually a 4th that you could choose to buy carbon offsets or renewable energy credits directly rather than through something like what I described here. So that is one option, but it's sort of an edge case. The one option that's available for customers are green supply offers. So you can choose in Illinois who you buy your electricity from. Some of the alternative retail electric suppliers do offer green energy options. These are typically structured through the supplier buying and retiring renewable energy credits to offset the usage of the customer. These can be sourced, however, from a wide range of resources, not necessarily local. often projects that have already been up and running. So you're not necessarily incenting the development of new generation. Green supply offers also tend to be priced at a premium. So if from a financial perspective, in terms of looking at renewable energy options, obviously there's a concern and interest in environmental improvement, but then there's also the economics of what you're doing. A second way to think about how you can obtain renewable energy in Illinois is through community solar, where you're subscribing to the output of the share of a offsite larger project that's in the same service territory as the customer is located. And then this is seen through what are known as net metering credits on your electric bill. So it's a way of having a more direct connection between your consumption and a solar project located within the same area of the state. The final option would be on-site solar, where you're actually installing solar on-site and it's offsetting the usage at the building, and then you can receive net metering credits for excess generation. Now, there are certain limitations to that. I think this is some of what Lois was getting at in terms of thinking about consumption and generation over time, and how much, if you're producing more than you're consuming, how long will those credits be available, and what future periods can they offset? So really, in the end, on-site solar really, I think, is the one that meets the requirements or the philosophy of the net zero building movement, where you're really installing solar at the location to address at a local level what your consumption is. Next slide, please. To put this in context of where we are in solar in Illinois, prior to 2018, 2019, there was probably only about 80 megawatts of solar in Illinois, and about 30 megawatts or so of that was larger scale projects. So again, not a huge amount of solar. That has really increased over the last few years from the adjustable block program and the Illinois Solar for All program, the two solar incentive programs that the Illinois Power Agency runs to incent the development of new renewables in Illinois. So these are some of the numbers in terms of about the megawatts, and then the numbers of projects that have been developed and completed through those two programs over the last several years. And this is just distributed generation. The Illinois Power Agency's programs are also supporting the development of hundreds of megawatts of community solar projects and thousands of megawatts of utility scale solar projects, things again, sort of outside the scope of what we're talking about today. We also would be expecting to see that the number of projects is going to continue to increase with some of the changes that came from the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in terms of increasing funding availability for the programs, as well as creating sort of some new categories that would focus on projects at public schools or projects developed by what are known as equity eligible contractors, and also projects featuring energy sovereignty, where we're ensuring that the development of the projects within the Illinois Solar for All program, that portion of those will have focus on building wealth in communities. What I wanted to point out with these numbers is just to think a little bit about the scale here, where you see thousands and thousands of residential projects being developed a year, hundreds of non-residential projects that tend to be bigger. The nonprofit and government sector is smaller, but there's a substantial number there. And if you look at the examples that Lois and Katie were showing, typically most of the activity in the net zero building movement has been in the government and nonprofit sector. So we're supporting a significant number of projects in that sector. But again, I think we're still looking at what are the scales in terms of what's being sort of supported by incentive programs versus the sort of higher touch, more complex projects that are being supported through the net zero building movement. Next slide, please. One of the issues that this raises is, how do you think about the environmental attributes of projects? So the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard is based upon the concept that renewable energy projects, as they generate electricity, are also generating renewable energy credits, which are basically a way of tracking the environmental benefit or environmental attributes of each megawatt hour of electricity produced by a solar or wind project. And then those renewable energy credits are sold to the utilities in Illinois, and the sale of those renewable energy credits then becomes an economic incentive to help develop the renewable energy projects. And we do this through a variety of ways, for utility scale projects through competitive procurements, and then through the adjustable block program and Illinois Solar for All program for on-site solar or community solar projects. And again, asking for exchange for the commitment to sell 15 or in some cases 20 years of renewable energy credits to utilities, that becomes a payment to the developers of the project. The question here is that the sale of renewable energy credits transfers the ownership of the environmental attributes to the buyer, in this case, the utilities. So what that means is that projects that participate in the IPA's programs and procurements are shifting the ownership of the environmental attributes to the utilities. And the utilities then retire those renewable energy credits as part of their compliance within the Illinois RPS. So as we're thinking about net zero buildings and how they're looking at what they're performing in terms of achieving environmental benefits, is there then a tension that's created between those goals and the fact that if the projects were to participate in our programs, they have to transfer those attributes to the utilities? Next slide. I think I actually got a little ahead of myself here. So that is, again, I think one of the interesting challenges that we have going forward is how do we reconcile these two different policy goals? The interesting ideas of net zero buildings really is the leading edge to think about what buildings of the future will look like, and the current structure in Illinois where we're recognizing renewable energy through the sale of renewable energy credits. Now, there are a variety of other funding sources that are available. The Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation was mentioned several times. They have funding opportunities for solar as well as net zero buildings. The changes to federal tax credit through the Inflation Reduction Act also sort of increases the value of those. That's another way in which the economics of renewable energy will continue to improve, as well as there are smart inverter rebates available for projects in Illinois, and that's something that's going to be expanding and beginning to bring in storage opportunities as well. Another way in which by having a building where the smart inverter basically allows the utility to dynamically control the output of the project and helps them maintain their grid better. Again, it's an increased value to the development of projects. I think fits in sort of the philosophy of net zero buildings. Battery storage is still the other key portion of this. We had a power hour last month talking about battery storage, and we're in the early stages of developing policies in Illinois to support the development of battery storage. And so as we think about what sort of incentives will be created for battery storage options, I think there's some real opportunities to think about crafting those incentives to make sure that net zero buildings, which again is so focused on the idea about how do you keep power locally and use it more efficiently, there's some real opportunities to make sure that those goals align. I think Lois used the term evolving, which I think really gets to where I think what is my takeaway about when thinking about net zero buildings, that this is still a new field that is sort of learning how to build buildings in new and different ways and incorporate into them features that maybe hadn't always been incorporated these ways as well, and then doing really data intensive monitoring and learning from buildings so that they can make sure that they live up to their goals. So I think what's key is that this is really pointing the way forward in terms of how can we think about what policies and programs do we want and practices do we want going forward to ensure that the ideas of the net zero building movement spread out into the greater building movement, to ensure that as we think about what our decarbonized future will look like, that buildings are playing their part in achieving that goal. So I think I think this was a really interesting power hour to learn more about what is going on in the net zero building movement and how that can excuse me, how we can think about what do we want to do as we move forward with evolving policies around the renewable portfolio standard. What can we do to ensure that some of these concepts are opportunities that will become more mainstream? So I think with that, I think we have a little bit of time left for questions.
So I saw that there was a question that our IPA fellow, Hannah McCory, had asked, and I think Lois has already answered that question. We have a question from our IPA employee, Program Associate Olivia Matthews. The question is, what is the most cost-effective investment for older homes and buildings that want to be more energy efficient?
Would you like me to take a stab at that?
Sure, go ahead, Lois.
So it really depends on the older home. I'm in the middle of renovating a bathroom downstairs in a house that was built in 1955. And when the contractor peeled off the wallboard, he found that there was no insulation in the outside on part of the house we haven't gotten to yet. So it's always energy efficiency first, because the avoided energy generation or consumption is always going to be your best bet. So in an older home, I would look at windows, I would look at insulation if you can, and I would look at your system. So the next time you have to replace a compressor or a furnace, look at the highest efficiency system that you can. And of course, in these days of electrification, if you have adequate power to your house, consider an air source heat pump and getting off the gas. So induction stoves and electric-based heating and cooling systems.
Thank you. We have another question from another IPA employee, Abigail Ramirez. She is the Program Associate for Illinois Solar for All, which is our income eligible solar program. And her question is, what does the cost look like when comparing retrofits to new builds?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. We do a lot of renovation at White as well as new construction. And the question is what you're planning to do with the envelope at the outset. If you're going to get to net zero, your energy model is going to tell you, and easily with some investigation on the sort of challenges of the envelope versus systems. It's harder in a retrofit to make investments in the envelope, which is already there, because many planners and owners kind of bank on reusing that envelope. And of course, every time you upgrade the envelope, you're spending more embodied carbon, which is not the topic of this seminar, but it does have carbon implications. So the one thing that I just want to say this, and it is on the carbon topic, and that is every time you put a new building into place, you expend about the same amount of carbon in that extraction, fabrication, delivery, and installation on site as you will use in carbon for about 30 years of operation. So retrofitting and keeping your buildings in place are a really important carbon strategy. If you have been listening to the comments being made in the news lately in the latest reports, we have about 9 or 10 years to try and hold the global warming temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees. Every time we put a new building in place, we are spending that. It's like mortgaging. We're spending that carbon right that day, as opposed to operating savings. So I think that the role of existing buildings and retrofits have to get much, they have to be celebrated.
I'd like to add on to that too. There's a lot of different ways to retrofit a building, and some are more invasive than others. And there's different costs to that. So there are 2 net zero projects in Illinois, one a school and one a community center. There were retrofits. Right now, one is the Prairie Trail School in Mount Prospect that pursued FIAS 0 and is in the final stages of its performance period. And what they did for that school is they actually built insulation onto the outside of the school through insulated panels on the exterior as opposed to the interior, which was a way to do that. And with the, so that's just a different type of cost to the materials, but also there's a lot of existing buildings in Illinois. And so we need to figure out how to address all of those. And not everyone is going to be able to move out of their building or home for that, in order for that renovation to happen. So looking at these exterior panels and some other less invasive ways of increasing the envelope and the insulation is going to be essential to get us there too.
Sure, thank you. I think Hannah has another question for Lois. She's asking, Lois, you mentioned geothermal heating in some of the new construction buildings. Is this economically viable for residential buildings? I know that ASHP costs have come down significantly. Would this be preferable to geothermal?
I have had some residential clients that have done geothermal, and generally they are the ones that have green blood. It is a premium cost. Air source heat pump will get you a pretty efficient system because the generation of equipment has come on. I was trying to type this in. The loop fields are really a premium cost because you need the rest of the equipment in the house to deliver the condition. Basically, what a geothermal system is doing is it's shaving off that energy requirement by using the ground as a heat sink or a place to reject heat. So two cautions on geothermal. One is that you have to have pretty much a balanced heating and cooling load because it's not just about extracting heat, it's about putting heat back in the wintertime. I did a house for a client with geothermal and we did such a high performance envelope that he didn't have enough heat in the winter because we weren't putting enough heat back in the ground. So lesson learned, gotta waste some heat in the summer. I hope that answers the question.
We have another question / comment from Lauren Becker. She's asking, she wants to confirm, we are still waiting to hear from the Treasury on what direct payment to entities like municipalities and universities will look like, as well as the Illinois Finance Authority's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, trying to stay on top of what will be coming down the pike.
Finance is not my area, and maybe Anthony can answer this, but I have to say that what I've read and what I think public agencies and institutions, we need to get clarity on is that apparently the incentives that have been sort of accruing to the private sector, there's supposed to be a mechanism inside of IRA that brings those benefits to the public sector, which will help in terms of, the grant funding for ICECF is going to run out. And then the question is, what's the next way to cover the premium costs of these net zero energy buildings that public institutions continue to make the investments because the premiums are offset by incentives through IRA?
Yeah, I think that's generally correct that Treasury Department has been doing a bunch of public comment processes and they're still working on the exact rules and policies that will govern how the direct payment and other aspects of the tax credits will work. Similarly, the Illinois Finance Authority is still looking at how their funds will be set up. They I think it was last week had a listening session to take public input on how they should prioritize their programs, and I think they were setting up some additional listening sessions as well. So there's still a lot of exciting opportunities coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, but what those actually will look like in practice is still something that will take time. If you think about the recent power hour we had about CJIR turns one, a lot has been accomplished in 1 year on state legislation. After 1 year, but still a lot to come. The Inflation Reduction Act only passed a couple of months ago and is national in scope and far as complicated as CJ is. The Inflation Reduction Act may well be more complicated. So I think as excited as we want to be that there's a certain amount of patience that's required to let all these policies and procedures get fleshed out and come into play.
Thank you. I actually do have a question. Maybe for Katie. So low-income and disadvantaged communities, they usually face, an undue energy burden. So what can be done to inspire communities to adopt net zero, energy approach, but at the same time, making sure that social equity goals are also met? What can be done at a maybe local level or state level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that there are several pilot projects going on right now that Elevate is working on for both multifamily and single family residential income eligible projects of what what does a electrification or decarbonization or getting to zero package look like? And what is the cost of that? So it could be scaled over time to other different building types. We just, Illinois Green just held a webinar with Elevate a few weeks ago called, I don't know, cutting carbon, something. It was a very long title. But they were basically looking at 5 different really common house existing home types in Illinois. And what does a package look like to retrofit all of those types? And how can you bring that to scale? And I think they are working with utilities and finance agencies to then figure out how to finance those retrofit packages for income eligible and affordable housing over time. So definitely that's where a lot of the funding is going, but also some study still needs to be done on what's the exact right package to make sure that people are comfortable in those homes. And you don't want to have everyone be a guinea pig on the right project. You want to find out what works best, how to finance it, and how you can scale that and make sure everyone's comfortable with their heating and cooling during those retrofit packages.
Great.
I think
Thank
some
you.
reports are coming out about that soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm looking at the Q&A to see. Okay, well, on behalf of the IPA, I'm also looking at the time. So I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. I hope it was educational, but above all, I want to thank our wonderful speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to provide this wonderful session and just really great insights into net zero energy buildings nationally and here in Illinois. Thank you so much. A recording of this Power Hour would also be available on the IPA website. Thank you. Have a great day.